Hello, my name is Sanjay Sarma, and I'm a professor of engineering at MIT. I'm also the vice president for open learning at MIT. And today I'll be talking to you about the future of education. And I'll begin by, let me just share my slides here, by giving you a little bit of history of how our education system has come to be. And then I'll also talk about some of the science behind what we see as with some dogma about how education ought to go and what the science actually tells us. So just to get going, our education system comes to us mostly from monastic traditions, whether it's in the West, which is frankly more recent, starting in Europe in the beginning of the last millennium, or in Asia, where some of it goes back BC, but a lot of it was religious, various denominations, Buddhist, Christian, Islamic. In fact, the Islamic universities of North Africa, some of them are extant from about 900 AD. And the concept of the university was it was a guild to give teachers the permission to practice teaching, usually a religious topic, but eventually it expanded to include other topics. In Europe, it included the arts liberalis from Greece. There is talk, of course, of how our education system owes its existence to the factory model. That's a little bit perhaps overstated. Certainly it did have an impact, but we do know that one aspect of the Industrial Revolution did make it into our education system, and that is the fact that when you make products in a factory, you need to test them. And so testing became a very central aspect of our education system. In fact, I sometimes say that while the crowning achievement of the first Industrial Revolution was interchangeable parts, I think that the unstated crowning achievement of the modern economy is interchangeable people. People who can do the same thing, and then you can pull one out and put a new one in with a little bit of training, and they can do it. And that is going to change. The fact of the matter is, if you look at the progression of the technological world over the last 100 years, you can see that, earlier technologies used to take 50, 70 years to be adopted, if you take telephone or TV, things like that. But then if you take modern technologies, like the smartphone, the tablet, you can see that they've been adopted very rapidly. And this only goes to about 2010. If you go further into the future, it gets even more rapid. Take, for example, what's happening with Bitcoin. So what that means is, and this is often said, that the half-life of technologies is dropping, and the half-life of skills is dropping. And so people need to continuously retrain. But the more important sort of second factor here is the growth of the gig economy. This is a chart from The Economist from about 5 years ago, and it shows the growth of self-employed folks in the British economy. And what it shows is that more and more individuals work for themselves. They go from gig to gig to gig. And when you do that, your degree matters maybe for the first gig, maybe for the first job, but eventually it is your performance of the previous gig that gives you the next gig. And the gig economy means that even more employees are both individuals are not just employees, they're actually the CEOs of their own lives. And they're the chief learning officers of their own life. They're the chief marketing officers, the chief technology officers. And with the changing pace of technology, that means that they need to continuously upgrade their skills. And this is going to be a calling of this year, the 21st century. I actually argue that the 21st century begins in 2021. It didn't begin in 2000 or 2001, because we've just spent a year during the pandemic training for a new reality. And then, of course, in 2019, the pandemic, when it struck, it made all sorts of other sort of tectonic changes to our industrial base. Industries like retail have been hammered because online commerce has taken off. Anything digital has gone up in value. And a lot of sort of well-known bulwarks of our society from the pre-pandemic have been shaken. For example, just for international trade has been shaken, and local supply chains are going up. Commercial real estate's taken a hit. Anything with travel or hospitality is taken a hit. And this means a massive job shift, which also means we need to fundamentally rethink our education systems because people have to retrain. It puts one in the mind of World War II. After World War II in America, 16 million soldiers had to be retrained for the workforce. And the US created something called the GI Bill. Other countries like Canada had similar things. Today, we have 10 million people unemployed after the pandemic, and a very large number of people who don't even check in because there's a very high labor non-participation rate. And so actually, to address this, my colleague Bill Bonvillian and I wrote a book that came out in February on workforce education, a new roadmap, which talks about the need for rethinking our education system. Now, why should we rethink the education system? Obviously, there's a demand side, which I just mentioned, but there's also a supply side, a human side. So we have learned over the last 110, 120, 150, down to 30, 20, 10, 5 years, we're learning about how the brain works. We're learning, for example, how we form memories. We're learning that this guy is called the prefrontal cortex of the brain. This is the CEO of the brain. And this is where we do things like planning, we do morality, regulation. We're understanding where emotion comes from. We're understanding the reward system, the limbic brain. And we're understanding how memories form and how they fade, and how important it is for memories to fade, how important it is for us to forget. As a part of remembering, when you start forgetting something, if you get reminded just before you go rusty on it, you actually remember it longer. And if you think about all that, and you look at the education system as it operates today, it's not really compatible. Why have these breakthroughs occurred? These breakthroughs have occurred in large part because of advances in science. We understand the brain because of experiments, both tragic and conscious experiments on the brain. Tragic experiments is, usually this happens during war, when someone gets injured in a side of the brain and they lose the ability to speak or the ability to form plans in an accident. And that's how we figured out, for example, Broca's region, Wernicke's region, speech, processing, and planning. But we've also made advances because of a new instrumentation. And one example of that is functional MRI. In a series of extraordinary advances that actually span the world, we're talking about an Italian, we're talking about Americans, we're talking about British scientists, we're talking about Japanese scientists, Korean scientists, all together, coming together, we realized that you can actually figure out which part of the brain is active. It's like a computer. Which chip is active? Is it the graphics chip when the brain is doing different things? And through that, and we can do it in an MRI machine. Turns out when some part of the brain needs more oxygen, that part is more active. And when blood rushes to that part of the brain, it turns out that oxygen-rich hemoglobin actually is weakly repelled by magnetic field. And by doing some signal processing magic on a regular MRI machine, you can figure out which part of the brain is active. So with that, we're understanding how the brain operates. Now, with that understanding, if you look at the way in which we teach today, was that based on science, or where did that come from? Well, the fact of the matter is, it's based on happenstance. It's based on circumstance. It's based on history. It's not based on science. And the lecture format that we take for granted today is about 1,000 years old, at least. Perhaps 2,000, perhaps 2,500 if you look at the amphitheaters. And the lecture format has been extremely resilient. This is a picture from Bologna in 1308. And there's a fundamental assumption in the lecture format, which is false, which is that the professor has a pen and the learner's brain is a sheet of paper. And all the professor has to do is write on the learner's brain and declare victory. And the learner's brain, if they don't remember it, you can wag a finger and say, you didn't pay attention, it's your fault. That's a false assumption. In fact, a better way to think about the way we formulate a model of the human, or humans or animals, in fact, formulate a base of knowledge, is sort of as if we were it's like a plant growing, we have to formulate a model of the world. And knowledge comes in as little chunks. Think of this as your prefrontal cortex. I've shown it as a leprechaun. And the leprechaun has to grab at the knowledge that comes in, run over, integrate it, reformat it, and create a very orderly a knowledge base that the brain can use when they need. The problem is that the size of this cauldron is actually quite tiny. And if you, and by the way, this is called consolidation, integration, sense making, saliency. If you tire the leprechaun out, it's going to just take a rest. And we know all this. So we know, for example, that that a lecture shouldn't be more than 10 minutes long, but every lecture in every classroom is, 90 minutes long, 45 minutes long, violating all these principles. And there's a lot of theory around this, cognitive load theory, intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. You got to get this guy going. There's a great quote from Plato, which is, the mind is not a sheet of paper or a professor to write on. I've modified the quote. It only works if it sells, if it is inspired. Plato's quote was, the mind is not a vessel to be filled. It is a fire to be kindled. And we ignore all that. And there are many philosophers who've pushed back and tried to sort of rekindle a form of education which is based not on the convenience of the teacher. We just try and write on the student's brain, but one that is more sympathetic to the human being. And all these people said the stuff before the science of learning was as well known as it is today. And the science actually, surprisingly, rather than giving us some clinical cold results, justifies everything they've said. And it turns out there are lots of these principles. I've just put a bunch here. I'm not going to go through them. But I'll go through them. I'll list them very quickly, but I won't give you details. If you lecture for more than 10 minutes, the mind enters a state called mind wandering. When you're absorbing stuff, you can only do it for about 10 minutes. When you're doing stuff, when you're sort of playing a video game or writing code, you can go for hours. That's called flow. That's output. But when you're inputting, about 10 minutes is optimal. It has to do with the way the hippocampus takes information in and creates short-term memories, and the prefrontal cortex manages all that. Over 10 minutes, you're done. But every lecture violates that. And there are a bunch of other principles. Retrieval learning turns out that after 10 minutes, if you ask questions, individuated questions, it actually improves learning. Space learning, I'll talk more about it. Interleaving, turns out that mixing things up actually leads to better learning. Anyway, there's a whole bunch of stuff. And we have historically done a very poor job of taking this stuff seriously. We take all those lessons. It's very hard to sort of capture them simplistically. But I'll give you one little concept that ties 2 or 3 of these lessons together. So this is a graph from Clark Quinn. I think it's a really beautiful graph. And what it shows is, if you learn slowly, so this is, 100% is what you've learned. I mean, you've learned 20%, you've learned 100%, and this is time. And the black line here is the time of the test. All right, because remember, I said earlier, everything is based on tests today. If you learn slowly, so you learn something, then give it some time, then relearn it. As you forget, you learn it again, add something else, and so on. You might not do as well at the test, but you'll remember it way longer. But if you cram, you'll actually do better than the test, but you're going to lose it very quickly. Reminds me, it's not a very appetizing thought, of a hot dog eating contest. I mean, you know what happens the next day, right? So our incentives are all messed up. Actually, the test favors cramming, but you want to survive for life. You want to become the CEO of your life. We should be doing this. And we don't, because it's not convenient, and we are stuck in this cycle. Here's another very quick thing, just one other example, and it's complicated. I'll explain to you. So let's say that you're learning to calculate the surface area of a sphere versus a cone. Should you do sphere, cone, 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 or should you do sphere, cone, sphere, cone, sphere, cone? The results are highly repeatable. You should go do sphere, cone, sphere, cone, sphere, cone. The more you mix things up, the better the brain learns, because we learn at the difference. But every chapter in every textbook is the chapter on spheres and the chapter on cones. This is called interleaved learning, and it has a very significant very significant improvement in results. So anyway, the bottom line is that as we learn how, oh, here's another one. This is actually beautiful. There's one other concept I want to make. It turns out that just as hunger and saliva go hand in hand with food, if you're hungry, you will eat, and the saliva helps you digest. The same thing is true for the brain. If you are hungry in the brain, it's called curiosity, and dopamine is a saliva, and you will learn better. And that circuit is called the dopaminergic circuit. There's interesting work on novelty and dopamine, and it's just a fascinating thing. But curiosity makes a big difference. So all these lessons tell us that we need to rethink the way in which we learn. We also know, for example, that when you learn doing with your hand actually matters, because it's called the mind-body connection. It's called embodied cognition. If you learn with your brain, but then you do something with your hands, the motor cortex gets engaged. By the way, I captured all this in a book I wrote recently. It came out last year. It's called Grasp, the Science of Learning, the science transforming how we learn. It's about the science of learning and captures a lot of these principles. So where should we go from here? So the problem right now is the way we teach today is we sort of have it backwards. First of all, because we're so testing-based and exams-based, we waste our in-person lecture time, in-person classroom time, just giving lectures. And lectures are one way, and we know they don't work especially after 10 minutes. There's no personalization, there's no individuation. Students tune out. Eric Mazur's talked about it for a long time at Harvard. Others have talked about it for a long time. And all the things we should be doing that are cognitively friendly, we just choose not to do. It's very tragic. Now, during COVID-19, people thought they were getting online education, and that's a fallacy. They were not. They were getting remote education, which is the worst of both worlds. It neither had the redeeming little charm of being in person, nor did it have the cognitive value of doing all this stuff right. We would just took lectures and put them on Zoom, and that's not online education. So actually, COVID may have done a disservice to a movement to improve education in general and to adopt online education.
Transcription, translation, universal genetic code, ribosomes.
This is true online education. True online education, what it does, as we do edX and Open edX, is asynchronous videos, carefully produced. This is Eric Lander. You can't have a better person than Eric Lander passionately explain the meaning of life. This is online. This is not. This is not online. This is remote education. This is properly done online education. So the future for us is this: do the lectures online. You can do them better, and a lot of these tricks, you can actually do them better online. So for example, you can do retrieval effect, you can do spaced repetition, interleaving. All these things you can do online better. And that's basically where the Open edX platform is headed. It's really exciting to me. Then the question is, well, what should the classroom do? Well, the classroom should focus on the things you cannot do online: context, curiosity, coaching, hands-on learning. There's a lot of work on coaching and deliberate practice. The power of learning from an expert telling a novice, do it differently, psychoanalyzing sometimes the misunderstandings. That is what the classroom should be focused on. So to me, I'm really excited that the Open edX software is going to enable this massive switch. By the way, I've just given you a sort of a multi-dimensional view of what is also called the flipped classroom or blended learning. Blended learning is a very coarse term. What does that mean? This is what it means. You've really got to figure out what you will do in the classroom, why, when, how, and you got to plan it. You can't just flip the classroom and show up in the classroom and assume things will happen. You really got to think it through. And when we come back from COVID, which hopefully will be soon in some countries, although the losses continue to be devastating in others, let's make the classroom count. So I'll end by saying that these are exciting times. These are also obviously scary times. Exciting because there is a silver lining. If humanity, as we limp out of the pandemic, we have to figure out what universities and education institutions will become. And my argument is they have to become a place of action, creation, and impact. And this will take planning, and it will take commitment. So thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to speak to you, and take care.